Continuing with our series Shtetl by the Sea, this week Hedy Davis takes us on a guided tour of the beautiful Muizenberg Synagogue.
There was a good, strong community in Muizenberg already in the early, I can't say 20s, before the 20s. 1916, they got themselves the first Jewish teacher. He was a Reverend Walt. And 2 years later, they needed a minister, Reverend Mickelson. He came via London to Cape Town. And they had to save money to buy first a little piece of land. And it was very, very hard to raise £1,400 in those days because the people were really poor. This is what most people don't realize. They came from very, very hard backgrounds. Some of them came with no possessions other than the family Torah, which they wouldn't part with. That's how those Torahs came to South Africa. People took their most cherished possession, which was a Torah, and then they would come with that to South Africa. They had no clothes, they didn't change. They just had one outfit that they wore on the boat coming over. For 3 months, they wore the same clothes. Here we are coming to the Muizenberg Synagogue. Originally, the first foundation stone was laid in 1924, but it took a while to get the building finished. Although the foundation stone was laid in 1924, the original builder went machula. That means he went broke. And so the community had to start all over again fundraising. And in 1924, this was a very poor community. It really was. The Ladies' Guild baked cakes and things like that just to try and raise the funds. So here we have it, the foundation stone laid by the Reverend A.P. Bender, whose name you will see on many synagogues built around the 1920s. And so one of the members of the community built the shul and didn't charge them 1 cent. His name was McCarthy. Not a very Jewish name you heard there. He met his bride in London, and the father said, she was the daughter of a rabbi, you want to marry my daughter, you have to be Maggid. So he converted. He went to South Africa, and within a few months, he'd worked so hard that he was able to bring his wife out to South Africa, his young bride out to South Africa. They lived in Cork Bay. They had 3 children. He was a member of the first congregation committee, and he was a faithful member of the community right until the day he died. He and his wife are buried in the cemetery in Muizenberg. Coming into the shul, you enter the feeling of peace and calm, the beautiful Magen David in the marble on the floor, the Magen David above us at the entrance. The president's boards face us as we come in, and we see the people who since 1919 have kept this synagogue alive and running. I'm entering the downstairs, which is the men's section. It's very much as it was nearly 100 years ago. The eternal light was donated when the shul was first opened, and still is lit to this day in memory of Mrs. Slessing, who had died. I doubt she ever came into the shul, though. In its heyday, the synagogue would be packed to the rafters. Children would sit on the steps. There would be an overflow service in the Wherry Road Hall down the road. And at the same time, there were a lot of kids who spent most of their lives playing on the field across the road. There's a little stream. I think there's not one person who didn't tell me at some time or other they slipped and fell and wet their shoes, because that was what they used to do. Not everybody went to synagogue. Here you notice the seats are small. People were smaller in those days. Great big lumps of men today find it uncomfortable sitting in the chairs because they don't have the place for leg room. As a lady, I have the same difficulty upstairs. There's just simply no leg room. But that's how it was. The beautiful windows were designed, the little green panels of glass. Today, nobody would put in little green panels of glass, but it was maybe the fashion. Maybe someone thought it would be decorative. It adds a sense of warmth and light to the synagogue.
the turn of the century, before the establishment of the Muizenberg Synagogue, there were no facilities available for Orthodox Jews in Muizenberg. They had to order kosher meat from Weinberg and walk to retreat for a minyan. Hedy Davis talks more about the shtetl by the sea.
The shul didn't keep rabbis very long. There was a Reverend Frank, though, who came in 1924 and worked for that community for 40 years. And he was kind of the backbone of the synagogue itself. This beautiful little synagogue never had a great choir. Choir masters came, choir masters went, until they had Reverend Goldwasser, who was a refugee from Germany, and he was there for about 25 years. There was a time there was a real need to get a rabbi, and Chief Rabbi Abrams suggested Rabbi Weinberg. He was from Oxford in England, and so he came out in the early 50s with his wife and 2 daughters. He stayed until 1961-62. We have the ark over here that was originally quite a bit forward and was rebuilt during the late 50s, or late 50s, I think, when it was decided that they would be able to put more seats for the women upstairs, and so they pushed it out towards the fence. A very interesting item is this stender. We call it a stender, a place to rest your book. And it was given to the synagogue many, many years ago in memory of the son of Reverend East. The son was drowned in 1909, and this stender is used to this day by people who stand here and pray. Here we are, climbing the stairs up to the ladies' gallery. Ladies were so strong they could climb. One should imagine the synagogue full. Even when Rabbi Weinberg was around in the late 50s, early 60s, he had a sense of humor. And there was Tilly Stern, who was not the most regular shul goer. One day, Rabbi Weinberg approached her. "Mrs. Stern, when I sit and look upstairs, I see Mrs. Rabbi. When Mr. Barnett looks upstairs, he sees Mrs. Barnett. When Abe Shapiro sits in the box, he sees Mrs. Shapiro. And when Bertie looks up," Mrs. Stern interjected at that point and said, "he sees Mrs. Rabbi, Mrs. Shapiro, and Mrs. Barnett." That is believed put an end to the rabbi's attempt to turn Mrs. Stern into a regular shul goer.
This week, our excerpt from chapter 2, verse 2 of Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, comes from Rabban Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who said, "Those who work for the community should do so for the sake of heaven, for then merit of their ancestors shall aid them, and the righteousness shall endure forever. And you, says God, I shall credit you with great reward, as if you have achieved it." Sadly, that's the end of this week's episode of Simcha. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to catch up on any previous week's episodes, log on to our website, www.spiritsister.co.za. From myself, Eitan Berger, and the whole team here at Simcha, have a great week and goodbye.